tassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Well, it's lovely to be back here, and it's nice to see familiar faces, not only from the half-day retreat that we did on Sunday, but from when I was here before. So it feels lovely, really lovely. Thank you for your warm welcome. One of the core teachings in the Buddhist philosophy, in the Buddhist doctrine, is the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. And so we can see that in the Four Noble Truths there's a really clear interest in investigating and inquiring into the nature of suffering, of stress, and seeing the way we experience that in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds. And for many of us, this gateway of suffering is really quite a large gateway. There's an awful lot of us who pass through this gateway in our journey of discovery, of inquiry, of wondering about if there's another way, if there's another way of living so that we can suffer less. So the suffering for many of us has been a catalyst, and I'm similar. That's been also part of my own story. But when we open up the Buddhist teachings and we look, the first noble truth is that there is stress and that it is pervasive. But the second noble truth is that there's a cause of stress. And that cause is desire, is wanting, is grasping for things to be different than the way they are, and pushing things away that we don't want. So this fundamental truth of dukkha is supported by tanha, or grasping, or clinging, or wanting, and not wanting. And then we can see that right exactly precisely where we experience the wanting is where we can experience the release of craving and the release of suffering. And so in this formula of dukkha, suffering, and the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the Eightfold Noble Path, the teachings are not just a philosophical framework. They are very clear practice instructions on how to work with what's arising, how to actually meet the present moment, how to bring careful inquiry and attention to notice when what we are experiencing is stressful, how to look for the grasping that is underlying the stress and the suffering that we're experiencing, and how to focus our attention on that grasping in a way to allow it to release. And it is profound. I think if all we did was had those instructions, that would be sufficient for a lot of freedom, a lot of liberation, a lot of release. And many people say complete freedom, complete liberation, complete release. Now, in my own journey, my own life story, my own personal experience, this basic theme of observing suffering, looking at the craving, and watching the release has also been very closely connected with my interest and hunger for connectedness, for love, for friendship, for relatedness, and in my experience of sexuality. Now, one of the things that happens for people when they hear a nun talking about sexuality is their eyes boggle, because people have this idea that if you're celibate, it must mean that you have zero contact with this life force, that this is not something that you know anything about. And in fact, the first time I gave a talk on love, sex, and awakening was many years ago, and it was a group of Dharma punks, and the word had gone out that that was the theme, and there was standing room only. It was like the hall was packed. And more than 3/4 of the people came, they didn't know me. So they had no idea who I was or how I lived or what my values were. They just thought, isn't this far out? A nun is coming and talking about sex. And they came as a theatrical performance because they were so sure that I couldn't have anything useful to say, that they were coming because they thought that there's got to be some kind of a theater happening with all of this. Anyway, I gave my talk, and they were surprised because I had some things to say that were new for them. So part of the reason why it's difficult for people to imagine that somebody celibate has something to talk about in this topic is because most of us equate sexual activity with sexuality. And if you're not engaged in sexual activity, then you're not connected to sexuality. And it's not the case. Sexuality exists independent of activity, and when there's curiosity and interest and introspection and the ability to focus, absolutely, the sexuality is there and can be very alive and vital when there's no activity. So these two are not necessarily conjoined. Yeah. So in my own personal life, there has been quite a lot of interest in the topic of love, sexuality, and awakening because they've been core to my own personal experience. Fundamental. They were topics that I was interested in from the time I was a child, from the time I was an adolescent, in my 20s, all the way through my adulthood, into the present. Now, the Buddha's teaching tells us that if we practice and focus attention in a particular way, if we follow the Eightfold Noble Path, if we bring the clarity that comes from living with integrity, from refraining from harm, from being appropriate in our sexual activity, from living in a way where we are not speaking untruths or harshly, when we bring together a clear understanding about right intention, when we bring together right livelihood and right speech, when we put together the effort to refrain from causing mind states that activate our anger and our fear and our confusion, and we also cultivate efforts that activate our joy, our compassion, our empathy, then all of these things, right mindfulness, right intention, right thought, right view, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right concentration, all of these different components of the Eightfold Path knit together a fabric which will deliver us into an experience of awakening. It's kind of like guaranteed. It's like if you put the pot on the stove and turn on the heat, it will boil. And it doesn't matter whether you have a belief in boiling or you don't have a belief in boiling. If you put the pot on the stove and turn it up and keep it there long enough, it will boil. You know, it will cook. It will do what it needs to do. So this is the teaching. And there is an enormous amount in this teaching which I have found to be hugely valuable. But the places that have been particularly curious to me has been around the way in which the clarity that comes from observation isn't what is needed when I get activated and my mind moves into the experience of a very young child. Now, have any of you experienced that? Laughing. So there's some resonance that this is something that's familiar, yeah? Something happens, it's triggering, it's activating, and all of a sudden I'm no longer operating from the adult, mature experience that I'm used to. I'm operating from the age of, or consciousness of a very young child. Now, the meditation instruction tells us that what we need to do is to observe what arises. But experience tells me that if I observe what arises with a consciousness of a young child, I have a very cranky child for a very long time, it doesn't help me. Because that experience of being activated into a regressed state doesn't need observation, it needs engagement. It needs tenderness. It needs healing in the same way that none of us, in good faith, would take a child that's 2 years old or 3 or 4 who is beside herself with distress and put her in a room by herself and tell her, stay by yourself and figure it out on your own. We would never do that. But we do that to ourselves all the time because we presume, or at least I presume, that the power of observation, which I have been really incredibly grateful to have access to in meditation, is a tool that I can use to solve everything. And it doesn't solve everything. It solves the things that are arising when there is a sufficient mindfulness present to observe them. It doesn't solve the things when the mindfulness is not present. And when we're in a grest state, that's particularly a time when the mindfulness is not present. We're not able to track what's happening. We're actually in another space. So then you have this mixture of this incredible hunger for love that arises, wanting connection, engagement, wanting to be seen, to be held, to be affirmed, wanting to have the experience be regulated by an external source without the ability to know, to name, to track, to label what's going on, and to actually ask for it. And then the overlay of observation doesn't help. It compounds because it's looking awfully like not being seen, not being heard, not being attended to in the way that happened to us before. So it feels more like a compounding of a problem rather than a healing of a problem. Now, once we turn into adults, or once we pass through puberty, then it is often the case that our hunger for love can express itself through the longing for sexual intimacy. And so these things get compounded not only with the movement of the mind entering into early states, but the expressing through the adult body and the capacity for sexual intimacy that adults are capable of having. And yet, when the longing for sexual intimacy is partially or primarily driven by a hunger to be seen and to be connected with in a way that one needed as a child, and that is not carefully tracked, then you have something that's very complex and very difficult to be attentive to, because these deep early childhood needs are expressing themselves in an adult way with the expectations that come with those kinds of adult behaviors. Yet the emotional need underneath it is actually coming from a child's hunger. It's complicated. And if you've got a person who's coming from that place, one of the things that can happen is it can be very evocative for the partner. And so now you don't have one child, you've got 2 children. And anytime you've got 2 children without an adult supervising, it doesn't take very long before you've got tears. And people are not clear about what happens, because all of a sudden something that can be intensely open and tender and heartfelt and connected and pleasurable can evoke the intense experience of lack, of want, of hunger, of need, and there isn't the ability to track what's going on, and it feels completely confusing. Now, another place where it gets confusing is that it can be the case, or it's often the case, in sexual intimacy, when there are 2 people who are connected in a heartfelt, tender way, that the actual experience of sexual intimacy is the experience of release of the sense of separateness. That's one of the things that happens in the psychosexual response, is that you let go of the sense of you as a separate, solid entity. And that is part of the reason why sexual intimacy is so pleasurable. But the problem is that release is release into pleasure. And pleasure, by definition, is not stable. And yet that pleasure of not being separate activates the hunger for more experiences of non-separation. And so what can happen in sexual intimacy is that it can activate a craving for non-separation, which then feeds the hunger for sexual intimacy without actually stabilizing the experience of non-separation. Now, that experience of non-separation actually belongs more stably in the domain of spiritual awakening. That's actually one of the things that can happen, and not just happen as a momentary, transitory experience, but happen as something that can be dropped into, can be known, can be a stable part of practice for people who understand what that is and how to access it. That actually is the domain of awakening. But in the domain of awakening, we are not releasing into pleasure. We're releasing into the experience of emptiness. And because we're releasing into the experience of emptiness, which is the nature of who we are and the nature of what everything actually is, then it is possible that that experience is not so highly conditioned and therefore not so deeply addictive. So we have this overlay of the hungers for love expressing itself through sexual intimacy that are masking a place of spiritual development. And yet, when we start teasing it all apart, we can see that the hungers for love belong. They don't need to not belong. We need to understand them, to honor them, to relate to them appropriately, and to bring to them the kind of care and attention and healing that they are asking for. The experience of the hunger for sexual intimacy can be many, many, many different things. It's not just one thing. And when we get clear about where this hunger is arising from, then we have the possibility of focusing our attention in a way where we can actually attend to it skillfully. But when we see that part of the hunger for sexual intimacy is to enter into and experience this feeling of non-separation, and we know that that is part of the domain of meditation practice, of spirituality, of awakening, then we can see that there are different ways, different tools, different avenues that we can have that experience other than only through sexual intimacy. Now, in this culture, there's this kind of crazy thing about sexuality as it's being like the pinnacle of fulfillment. It's, the cult of eros, where, the billboards and the advertising and the everything tells us that if we're not in a sexual relationship, we're worse than dead, That there's something about that which is like, that's terrible. And conversely, I have seen posts and friends sharing, they're in a relationship. And everyone thinks that's just fantastic. Well, it's fantastic as long as it's fantastic. And when it's not so fantastic, it's not so fantastic. It's not dependent on the intimacy. It's dependent on the relationship that supports it. And how well the two are tracking the terrain that is actually being navigated, which is complex. It's not at all straightforward, because intimacy evokes the lack of intimacy. A connection with somebody will magnetize the places where it was absent. And those places of absence pulls out the times when we didn't have our needs met. We weren't seen. There was too much or too little connection. And so oftentimes what happens in romance is rather than developing the skill to track, to attend, to heal, there's just the movement towards the pleasure and the cycle of the lack. And so it's up and down and up and down and up and down, and it actually isn't regulating. It isn't healing. It doesn't allow the person to rest. Now, the practice in meditation is to work with what's arising and to focus on the places where we are experiencing grasping as a central part of our practice. And so, independent of our lifestyle choice, independent of whether we're celibate or whether we're in relationship, if we take the practice to heart, it means that it gives us the tools to begin to look at this whole process as part of our spiritual practice, not separate from it. And as this becomes part of our spiritual practice, we get more skill at being able to notice these different inclinations that are arising and our habitual response to them. And as we notice our different responses to them, that can give us the possibility of developing more skillful responses. So like in myself, it took a long time for me to realize that when something activated me and triggered me and I was into a state of a regress, that it wasn't helpful for me to overlay the years of meditation practice that I had on top of that. I needed to find new skills to deal with that, to drop into an age-appropriate response. And when I did that, it took very short time, relatively speaking, to come back to having the access of resource and being able to work with it through observation. Now, in my experience, the process of awakening or the teachings on awakening are talking about awakening to what is, awakening the qualities of love and compassion and joy and equanimity, and awakening to an awareness that pervades time and space. And that awakening to an awareness that provides time and space is really the experience of non-separation. Because in that, there is no sense of being separate from anyone or anything. There's deep fulfillment, there's deep contentment. There isn't an experience of lack. And it isn't dependent on certain conditions to have that come together. So people are here in a wonderful community that has teachings, that has support, that has community. And yet it's often the case that this cluster of themes is rarely talked about. Now, I have been listening to meditation talks, Dharma talks, for 35 years. And in 35 years, I have heard 5 talks on the theme of sexuality. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were all by men, and not one of them actually attended to the topics that were of interest and alive for me. It's like for one reason or another, or 10 reasons or 100 reasons, these topics are somehow seen to be separate from awakening. And that's not my experience. Because when we don't have a handle on all of this, we don't have a handle on our life force. And when we don't have a handle on our life force, we are not endowed with the energy that is required in order to see clearly, to have the stamina to persist, to have the fortitude to see the veils of confusion for where they are and to allow them to release. It's imperative. So the Buddha offered us the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and extremely clear instructions on meditation. And this is invaluable, absolutely invaluable. But in my own personal experience, I also needed to learn how to not only just observe, but to engage and interact with stuff that observation was not what was needed. And I could not find that within the tools of meditation. I could not find that within the monastery. I had to find parallel processes and parallel paths to bring those skills into a situation where I couldn't find it otherwise. And I did. I went, I looked, I found they exist. They totally exist. And so the more I got resourced with these parallel processes, the less I suffered. The less I suffered was very congruent with my values and aspiration to awaken. It's not separate. It's not separate in the sense that it is part of the process of awakening and releasing the suffering. It is distinct in the sense that the tools of observation are not always sufficient to do the healing that's needed. And so then we are left with the choice of how do we bring healing to where it's needed. But one of the telltale signs of healing, one of the telltale signs of release of suffering, is contentment. That there isn't a sense of being insufficient, that I need something that's outside, that there is something that I have to get or have to have or have to get rid of in order to feel what I am, which is content. And my own process of observation has been that this has been a slow, gradual movement towards greater degrees of understanding and greater experiences of contentment. And the Buddha's path, the practice of meditation, the power of observation has been fundamental. And I have needed to learn how to engage with those powers rather than to only use them to observe. And the combination of engagement and observation has been profoundly healing. So I will pause here, invite comments, questions, feedback. Yes, please. It is being recorded. Yeah. Yeah.
direct solve to that particular kind of pain. That somehow answered something and allowed me to feel content and present. And so I'm at a time now where I'm seeking, how do I find that within myself, rather than looking outward for that.
So it's a beautiful question, and obviously there's not an easy or simple answer to it. And I think, there are several ways to work with that. One is to develop nourishing friendships that are not just with lovers, but with colleagues, with friends, with mentors, that is loving and tender and responsive and caring. Yeah, so that it's not just focused on one person. And the other is to see if it's possible to touch what's underneath that sense of lack. And to bring to that sense of lack exactly everything that you got from your partner to yourself. Now, for me, I have for the last 15 years had a really strong relationship with nature. And part of the reason why I live in Colorado and in Colorado Springs is because I'm right next to a power spot. And so I go into the Garden of the Gods, which is 10 minutes walk from my doorstep. And it's like for me lying in the lap of the mother. I feel held, I feel embraced. I feel like there is nothing I can do or be or bring or feel that is not welcome. And because I feel that or perceive that coming from an external source, then all of my resistance dissolves. And as my resistance dissolves, there's more capacity to be with those feelings myself. And as there's more capacity to be with those feelings myself, there's less hunger and longing for something outside to do something for me inside. So I have a bridge that allows this to channel from something that starts feeling outside to gives me to the access to where those qualities are inside, that I can know them myself. So that I can go to the garden, and I have many times agitated, anxious, fearful, confused, in tears, upset, angry, desperately lonely. And it doesn't take long, and there's contentment. Because I cease to be in a reactive relationship with the feelings.
So this is a bit like the guest house, Rumi's guest house, welcoming this particular visitor.
That's right.
Challenging there it is.
Yes. Yeah. 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 So I've left you speechless. No, there's a question in the back. Yeah. So the question is how do you move from observing to engaging? Is that right? Okay, I couldn't do this initially by myself. I needed somebody to help hold the space for me until I got a feeling of what that felt like to do both. To be able to notice what I was feeling, the terror or the clamp downness or the disallowing or the fear. And also to bring forward the care, the kindness, the ability to name, to notice, to begin to frame what was happening in a language that made sense for the kind of age of the person that I was at. And so initially I had people helping me do that. And then I started to kind of feel my way into doing that for myself. And so in my conditioning, in my family situation, there were like, sadness for me was like terrifying. I wasn't allowed to feel sad. So there was a situation when something happened and I felt very sad, and I didn't just feel sad, I went into a place where it was terrifying to feel sad. And I remember it very distinctly because I was in Chithurst Forest Monastery, and Chithurst has this pond, and there's lots of ferns, and there's lots of bunnies, and there's lots of very lovely soft things. So I had a way of kind of tuning in and sensing about how old I was, and I imagined or sensed that I was about 3 or 4. So I imagined taking myself by my hand, and going for a walk around the pond, and talking to the bunnies, because the bunnies are actually very wise, and they know about sadness, and the bunnies are allowed to feel sad. And so when the bunnies were allowed to feel sad, then all of a sudden this thing that was like frozen and locked in started to release. And rather than experiencing myself as 4, as long as I was talking to the bunnies about how important it was to be sad, it took very short time to transition from whatever was going on into, recognizing there's sadness and there's this reactivity to sadness. I don't want to feel sadness. I was back into the capacity of being able to observe what was happening and track it. But I had to bridge it with something that was language appropriate for the time. And another situation is I also have weird stuff around being angry. Angry is totally not acceptable. So something happened, I felt very angry, and then I clamped down and disallowed the anger. So I did the same thing, except rather than talk to the bunnies, I talked about hitting somebody over the head with a frying pan. So I'd sing myself a song at the age of the clamping, and it would release the clamping. It would help me frame what was going on, which then allowed me to use the observation skills that I had and then track it. Oh, okay. This is anger and resistance to anger. And once I was there, then I didn't need to sing songs about frying pans and hitting somebody over the head. Does that help? So creativity, playfulness, and really tuning in, using your body as a vehicle for being able to assess what age you're at, and then really just allowing your creativity to imagine what would a 3-year-old need to help them feel okay about being angry when all of a sudden they're angry and they don't know how to handle it. Yes, please. Yeah. So as a layperson, your commitment is not to celibacy, okay? You absolutely have the range of choice to engage in sexual pleasure as part of your lifestyle. And so you get to see how that all works in terms of when you engage in sexual intimacy and experience sexual pleasure, what that does to the feeling of contentment. Because satisfaction and contentment are actually not the same. You can be released or satisfied with your hunger, but that's not the same as feeling content. So it's an inquiry. And I would really encourage you, rather than clamp down, to open to that inquiry, to explore. Now, the Buddha's encouragement is to explore within the context of the precepts. So the context of the precepts for a layperson is to refrain from engaging in sexual misconduct, okay? And misconduct would be having relationships with people who are already in committed relationships, or having relationships with somebody who's underage. Those kinds of things are considered sexual misconduct. Now, from the perspective of practice and inquiry, it's a very, very important journey to look and watch what happens when we engage with desire and what is the experience in terms of the nature of satisfaction and the nature of contentment. Not as a judgment, but as an inquiry. There's a big difference between judging it and between inquiring about what it actually is like. Now, for many people, there is a lot of room just to learn how to tolerate the experience of pleasure. That actually is a big, huge learning and an important part of healing. Because for whatever reason, they were cramped down, and it was like totally intolerable to experience pleasure. And so we need to learn how to allow pleasure into our body and feel it. Now, interestingly enough, in meditation, we can do the same. Because in the experience of what happens when the mind comes into stillness is that the body is filled with pleasure. And you read the description of what happens with rapture and, ripples and undulating feelings and bubbles and ecstasy. This is in the suttas, okay? It's like it's allowed, And the description with this kind of pleasure is that it's our task to suffuse our whole body with it in the way that you would massage water through they didn't have soap. They had soap powder, and they would wet the soap powder, and they would massage the soap powder until it was completely saturated with moisture. So our task is to allow the rapture that comes with meditation and to learn how to saturate and suffuse our whole body with it. It sounds okay to me.
Wow, I think maybe that would be a good place to stop. Or alternately, maybe we should just keep going. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to just note that in addition to the generosity of financial support for our Amma, that if anyone feels moved to support her work in other ways, most of the people who actually serve as her team, whatever to call it, don't live in Colorado Springs. There are people all over the country who really, do this job or that job. So if there's anyone who's feeling moved to support or at least inquire in that way, there's also, there's a sheet back there?
There's a sheet that talks about the volunteers, but if you're interested, when you sign up on the e-list, put a check by your name, and we'll find a way to get in touch with you and figure out what kind of things you'd like to offer and put you together with the kind of things that we need.
Just to know. So thank you, Amma. Yeah. Thank you for coming at the end of your long journey.
Yes.
And please come again.
So shall I close with a chanting?
Very briefly, yeah.
Okay.